I'm Rick O'Shea, the literary curator of the UCD Festival, and I'd like to welcome you to this, the second virtual edition of UCD Festival at Home for 2021. The UCD Festival is unique and award-winning, one where the global UCD community of students, alumni, future students, and also the wider general public join us for free online events. For the second year, we're not on campus, but instead where you are, bringing you all of the inspiring, engaging, and informative activities of the regular festival here for our digital and worldwide festival audience to enjoy. I'm particularly thrilled to be highlighting the series of UCD Festival at Home conversations. There are over 20 chats and discussions taking place, and with nearly 100 free, virtual, and engaging events also running across the weekend, there's something for everyone in the family to enjoy. You can stay up to date on the full UCD Festival at Home programme at ucd.ie/festival. And don't forget, you can join the conversation through the chat function on YouTube or on Twitter using the hashtag UCD Festival. Do get involved. Thanks for joining us and enjoy the event.
Delighted to welcome you all here this evening tonight to this conversation on the power of giving and the role of foundations and trusts. It's a topic which is very close to my own heart, and I know for a lot of you joining us here tonight, I have no doubts it'll be quite a similar situation. And in a time of crisis, as we've experienced and we continue to try and deal with, the timing of this conversation, I think, is very apt, as we all seek to contribute and do what we can to give to those most in need, particularly at this time of need for support. I'm absolutely delighted, and I feel very, very privileged to moderate this discussion here tonight with two excellent speakers who I will introduce to you very shortly. But firstly, just to introduce myself, my name is Eilis Murray. I'm CEO of Philanthropy Ireland. And just to maybe kind of mention a little bit about what does Philanthropy Ireland do? Well, Philanthropy Ireland, it's a membership organisation, members being grant-making trusts, foundations and donors. We champion the power of strategic giving to effect real and lasting change, and that is what our mission is about. We work across three key pillars of activity: the promotion of philanthropy as we seek to grow and develop philanthropy here in Ireland, raising awareness of various models and avenues of giving, an event such as this here tonight being a very particular and apt example. We work on policy for philanthropy, believing that enabling and supportive environment is important for good giving, and particularly as we all seek to make even greater impact with our giving and what that might look like. We also support the practice of philanthropy. Our own members, we always say that the give has to be as good as the ask. So the exchange of knowledge and learning amongst members is critically important, and we facilitate that through the practice program that we actually run within the organisation. So our membership is diverse, but we all share the same mission. That's to strengthen the social sector by advancing knowledge, practice and understanding of philanthropy and good giving. So I think from that, you will fully appreciate that we're absolutely delighted the theme of giving is the subject for discussion here tonight, here this evening. So let's get that discussion going. And I'm going to introduce you to two absolutely fantastic speakers who I know will inspire you here this evening. First, I'd like to introduce you to Denise Charlton. Denise is leading the Community Foundation for Ireland and their response to COVID-19. A human rights, equality and social campaigner, she was appointed CEO of Community Foundation for Ireland in July last year, and I think in that short space of time has had an incredible impact in even just the very recent months. Her commitment to equality has seen Denise successfully take leadership roles in campaigns on marriage equality, children's rights and immigration reform, to name but a few. Previously serving as CEO of both the Immigrant Council of Ireland and Women's Aid, Denise has a deep understanding of the sector and the positive impact that giving can make in our society. As a consultant and non-executive director of a number of philanthropic entities, she's committed to policies that nurture the importance of philanthropy in delivering equality, sustainability, and fairness for all. Denise, you're very welcome here this evening.
Okay.
And I'm going to move on and introduce Joan. And Joan, for many, will need no introduction. I know that. Joan has served as a member of Seanad Éireann from March 2016 to 2020. Nominated by the Taoiseach to represent the voice for mental health in Ireland, she was appointed as chairperson of the Joint Oireachtas Committee of Future Mental Health and successfully delivered 2 pieces of legislation through the Seanad. Excuse me. But for many, Joan is recognised as the founder of Pieta House, a charity so very well known to all of us. She served as CEO from 2016 to 2017, having founded it in 2006, from 2006 to 2017. I was lopping off a number of years there, Joan, my apologies. During that time, Joan oversaw the establishment of 10 centres nationally, employing 180 people and managing a budget of over 5 million. And I can only imagine how it took to grow to that level of budget from the early days. She developed the strategy, oversaw its implementation and tracking of key metrics. And in that, she built and cultivated strategic relationships with charity partners, donors, advocates, and policymakers. She also went on to establish Solace House, the first suicide and self-harm intervention service outside of Ireland. The charity quickly grew and to 2 centres operating in Queens and Yonkers in New York. Leading this project, she developed strong relationships again and fostered great support from key political leaders, business professionals, and philanthropists in the US and Ireland. Joan, you're so welcome, and thank you so much for joining us here this evening.
Glad to be here. You can see me sniffing, by the way. I'm so sorry, but this is cold. So forgive me if I start sniffling.
No worries at all. I think May has been so unkind to us all with kind of the poor weather, etc., but we'll get through it. Denise, if I could maybe start with you and maybe just even dive into the theme as we have it here tonight. What do you think is the power in giving, and I'm even thinking of the many benefits in giving that extend beyond maybe just even what you're giving to or the cause that you're actually supporting. Maybe to just take us through that a little bit from your experience.
Yeah, so at Community Foundation for Ireland, we say that we have donors that are of major and minor means. And I suppose there's a range of motivations for giving from their perspective. For some, it's because they want to give back. They've done well, they've maybe sold a business, merged a business, and they want to give back. And that might be to their local area, to their local community, or to something that's very dear to their heart. So we work with them on that. Some want their family to be involved. They're really interested in intergenerational giving and giving collaboratively as a family. And so we work with them. And then others are corporates who are saying, we'd really like to be able to turn the dial on such and such an issue. And that's part of who we are in the world. And we want to do it on that basis. And I suppose people come to Community Foundation for Ireland because we do the hygiene factor. So we do the due diligence, we mind the money, we have an endowment. And so people can, I suppose, put that stuff out of the way and get all that done. And then they can really concentrate on their giving and their journey of giving. But for many, and I've been on the other side of giving and seen the impact of it for many, many years. For many, I think the motivation is, people come to the Community Foundation because they say to us, we want to know where the greatest need is. And that need may be defined with their interest. So it might be global warming and climate, it might be addiction, it might be giving young people access to education, or it might be, really we want to make sure that our community that we came from, we want to give some place-based giving and we want to really concentrate on an area. And it's incredible to work with donors with all their different motivations and engagements and rationale for giving. But for most of them, it is to give back, I think, and to turn the dial on something, whether that's minor or major.
Sure. And lots of reasons why people might give to things. And I think interesting there, Denise, even where you mentioned about, that it's not necessarily just people of means, but that there's such a span in terms of giving. And maybe picking up on that, Joan, I mean, just thinking even in terms of Pieta House, and I'm even thinking of recent Darkness into Light and, events such as that. But you had your major donors, but you also had the other span, and the power of giving within that range. Just to comment on that.
I mean, we relied very heavily on the minor, the ordinary Joe Soap in the street who was willing to shake a bucket or have a coffee morning, or obviously, Darkness into Light. But so it was much simpler for me. I mean, I can absolutely understand what Denise is saying, that she would see a whole cohort of donors, coming from different perspectives and for different reasons. In Pieta's case, it was two very clear reasons. One was the person obviously had lost someone to suicide. And the extraordinary thing there was when someone loses someone to suicide, it's like an urge. They're driven by the fact that they don't want another family to go through the same thing. So therefore they start fundraising just for that particular reason. This generosity is extraordinary. But the other thing I've seen, and I often would give a talk about mental health, and I created this thing called the 9 boxes. 9, if you tick all these 9 boxes in your life, the chances are you're going to be pretty contented. And one of the boxes is giving back. And it's not just about donating. Anybody can put a fiver into a bucket. It's not just about donating. It's not just about giving your time. It is what happens to you as a person when you give. And you have this extraordinary feeling of feeding your own soul. And that, I think, is the biggest thing and the biggest motivation, not only to help people, and as we all know, the Irish are extraordinarily generous, but we're also feeding ourselves. We're feeding that feeling that we're doing something that's right, and it's feeding down here. So, I just, so I can imagine that the big donors must be feeling pretty good too, but it doesn't matter if you give a euro or 100,000 euro, you still get that wonderful feedback,
So kind of that sense, Joan, of, some of the power in giving, obviously in terms of the cause that's actually being supported, because it can do things, but that for the donor as well, that there is so much that they get back and they get out of it, that's critically important as well.
And it's absolutely. I mean, I saw something on Nationwide recently. A young family had lost their dad to suicide, and they got this old bus, and they did it up, and they invited people to come in and have a cup of coffee, whatever, and people obviously donated. But that family felt that they were doing something positive out of something that was very, very tragic, and that's going to help them on their journey of grief. So there is always some sort of, I mean, we always say, about altruism. We always get back something by giving, for sure.
Yeah, and I think that's quite a powerful message about, what we get back out of it as well. And Denise, just kind of coming back to you, and you mentioned there about, families within the foundation that might be giving, or, kind of the various ways that people kind of do it. And maybe just to comment, I know you touched on it, but maybe just to comment a little bit further about what inspires people to give. Like Joan was speaking there about the family who did the bus because their dad had passed on. The inspiration for people to come to the Community Foundation, to engage with you, to get involved, I'm sure it comes from very many different sources.
Yeah, sure. I suppose the best way to illuminate it is probably to rise up some examples. So recently we launched an All-Ireland Fund, which was really to provide an opportunity for groups north and south to work together, because post-Brexit and all that's happening, and it was launched by the Minister. And that came from a small family fund, a family whose father was from the north, wanted groups to have an opportunity to work together. They set up a donor advice fund. And then we went out to other donors and said, well, we have this amount in the pot. Do you want to join us? And we're doing a pilot. So we got it to 500,000. Now, we have been asked for 4 times that amount in the applications. We've obviously hit a nerve. But that's fantastic for that family, you know, because really that was in their father's, I suppose, honour. And we've seen other situations where, you know, a family have come in and they've said, really, global warming is the greatest crisis that is going to affect the next generation. And we want our young people in our family want to work on global warming and climate change. And we see that you have worked in the area on circular economy and biodiversity. So we want to join that collaborative effort, because on our own, we're kind of wondering what we can do, how we can have an impact. So we want to join your climate fund. COVID saw a lot of families and corporates step up to the plate. So we had a COVID emergency fund, and some families and corporates came in and said, you know what, we're very interested in mental health. So we'd like to work with the organisations that are trying to pivot and adapt to respond to mental health. Others said we want to really support those that are suffering most in the pandemic. So kids who don't have a laptop, or older people who are isolated. You know, so they joined the COVID fund. Some said we want to say where the money goes. Others says we trust you as the community foundation to know where the most need is. So there's all sorts of motivations for families and individuals and corporates. I suppose what our secret sauce is, or what we're trying to do, is to really work with families to say, where is your interest? And we can do that bespoke, because we work with so many organisations, or there's a collaborative approach over here. Usually, I agree with Joan, there very often is a reason, not a reason, but if you talk to the family, there's an interest and a connectivity to certain issues because of life experience. And sometimes, you know, it isn't. It's young people saying, actually, I'm very interested in digital, and I see that digital inequality is the new poverty. We want to do something about that. You know, so it's exciting for individuals and families, because they really get to have a think about the social issues or the issues in communities that they care about, and they're able to, you know, do something about it, either individually, as we say, in a bespoke way, or collectively with others.
And I think that piece about kind of working collaboratively on things, you know, it's the power of one, you know, and if we all kind of come together, you know, in terms of kind of that value that can be added within that, and I think, you know, kind of amplifying that a little bit. I think it's quite an interesting thing, and partnering in that way. And I think for anybody on the call here tonight, it's for them to understand that there are avenues for people to partner, along with kind of finding what that trigger is, as you say, Denise, in terms of kind of what the trigger is of kind of interest and importance. But Joan, maybe coming back as well a little bit to kind of what you mentioned there when you were speaking earlier about kind of, you know, Irish people are generous, but sometimes not just about giving the money. And I'm thinking here about, you know, where we talk about the 3 T's of philanthropy, that, you know, or giving, that it's not just about money, but it can be about time, it can be about influence, it can be about talent, time, talent, and treasure. The 3 T's. And I'm just wondering about that in terms of kind of how does that marry with, obviously you need, and I'm thinking of your experience within Pieta, obviously you need finance to run the project, but are there other things as well that can make the difference and that can add to not just writing the check?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the early days, in the early couple of years, we didn't want to be a service that closed at 5 o'clock in the evening. You know, suicide and suicidal distress doesn't stop at 5 o'clock on a Friday evening either. So we wanted to work until 9 o'clock at night and work and be open on a Saturday and Sunday. And obviously in the early days, we didn't have the few bob to do that. And this is where volunteers came into it. And it was extraordinary, because I set up in Lucan I think I had nearly all the women in Lucan doing some hours, for Pieta House at night time, or Saturday and Sunday. And then, of course, the other part was, we would have this theory that the person coming to Pieta was coming to a home. And when you invite someone into your home, the first thing you do is you say, "Will you have a cup of tea?" And
sure.
The policy was you don't take no for answer. We would be like your woman on Mrs. Whatever Doyle. Go on, go on, go on. So again, we had volunteers that would come in and they would be treating the clients as if they're their long lost pal. I mean, it was extraordinary. So, I mean, the volunteers created the policy really in Pieta. Then, of course, you have the board. The board is crucial. They bring their time and they bring their talents. It must be very difficult, especially dealing with the founder, who can be a pain in the ass when it comes to wanting something and the board doesn't want to agree with you. And for doing all that. I mean, look, the reality is our country would be on its knees if it wasn't for the charities of this country. We are the people, the organisation that fill the gaps, that put in services where our government can't put them in. So we are an extraordinary country, again, from a charitable perspective, creating charities.
And I think that's interesting, even that concept of kind of getting going, the volunteer element, etc., in terms of building it. But I suppose it kind of also kind of brings me back, and maybe this for you, Denise, to kind of maybe comment on the importance of multi-annual funding and planned giving, and I'm thinking both in terms of kind of the causes to enable them, you're talking about your board there, Joan, to have the kind of the vision of kind of, yes, we can do this. So to plan ahead, and the importance of that, Denise, in terms of multi-annual funding, I'm quite certain even for UCD Foundation, again, that it's something that's of critical importance, for any causes in terms of trying to be able to put together that program and have that line of vision of, well, this is what we can do and have this impact, that it adds to the impact that can be achieved. Would that be fair?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the voluntary and community sector, and we always say this, it's as big as the agricultural sector, it's huge. And the services and the programs and the advocacy that it provides, like the country couldn't survive without it. But it's going to be under a real challenge. So if we look at a 14 billion deficit guesstimate going forward, that's going to affect core funding for many, many groups. So philanthropy often comes in and it supports innovation, agility, volunteerism, programs, scalability. It can do things, maybe take a bit more risk than state funding can. So it can do things that others can't. But I think collectively with state funding, it can really look at a longer term approach. So if we have some of these organisations that are really offering vital services and advocacy across the country, if they're consistently trying to raise money, and Joan will know this so well, and I know it from being on the other side, it is taking away the time from doing the job that you're trying to do. And if you're trying to do that on an annual basis, it's really, you can't have secure staffing, you can't plan, you can't be strategic, all the things we're asking of our voluntary and community sector, of our communities. We're looking at the URSI report that we did, that we funded as the Community Foundation, and it's saying young people have been decimated and will be decimated as part of this pandemic. And so we would like to look with donors and grantees and say, well, what could we do over the next 5 years that would help that? Yeah. How can we help the recovery of young people? So if our donors come on board and say, you know what, we agree with that, and we would like to stay with those organisations for a period of time and give multi-annual funding, it really can have an incredible impact, particularly if it's done collectively. And we talk to the sector all the time. We've really deep connectivity with the sector. And that's what they're saying to us. We desperately need over the next while, in terms of the recovery, that donors would consider multi-annual funding, that we would know for a period of time that we're going to try and give these kids in this area access to employment. but we won't even know if that's successful unless we can do it over a 3 to 5 year period. You know, we're going to change the tide on loneliness and isolation for older people. Then, if they can do it collectively over a period of time, I think it's fantastic. It's not always possible. And sometimes when donors come in, they're not quite ready to do that. But certainly our experience as donors go on a journey, I think they recognise the real value of multi-annual funding where possible. So we certainly would see the value of it and really hear the sector when they say, you know, the need for it. And as I say, I was out there for years, you know, trying to manage big, you know, budgets. And when you only have annual funding, it does create huge pressure.
Yeah. And I'm sure, I think it's an interesting point you touched on, Denise, there as well, about the journey, the giving journey, the philanthropy journey, you know, and I suppose coming back again to yourself, Joan, just, you know, I'm sure you can identify, you know, having run kind of the organisation and having started out convincing people, you know, moving to that multi-annual was probably critically important for Pieta. And maybe even just to comment as well in relation to kind of having donors that came on the journey with you and that maybe grew with the project as you grew as well, as the project grew.
Yeah, so I don't know if you know this, but starting Pieta, I borrowed 130,000, and we used our home as collateral. And the funny thing about that was I didn't blink an eyelid. We had 4 teenagers at the time, but my husband nearly died every night when he'd go to bed and fall asleep. He'd wake up in fear. But we wouldn't have started unless we had done that. And then what happened, we weren't financed at all by the HSE for years. Not for years. And it was the best lesson ever not to be dependent on anybody. And it got to the point when the HSE did get involved. Of course, we were grateful, but we would never allow them to give more than 10% of our overall budget. And the reason behind that was that we were not dependent, that, like, you know, as Denise just said, you know, terrible things have happened in the last year where money is going to be withdrawn and charities will fall by the wayside, for sure. And we wanted ever to get to that point where we are expanding, then all of a sudden one year the HSE, sorry, can't help you this year. So it forced us to become self-sufficient. And while we had donors and big donors, I mean, the very first big donation I ever remember was from the Lions Club. And they gave 20,000. And this was magical because it was going to sustain us for several months, you know. But it was still very important to be self-sufficient because we couldn't keep that same well all the time, like the community funds or, you know, the Ireland funds or whatever it was. Couldn't keep doing that, so we had to become self-sufficient. But, you know, again, we're all relying probably on the same group of people all the time, you know. And I remember about the donors, you know, I remember the chairperson of Pieta House there a couple of years ago said that maybe the way to go is to be in a partnership, 50-50 with somebody like the HSE. And I'm saying, absolutely not. The only people that we can rely on for sure are the people who love what they're doing insofar as that they think that they are helping other families in this country. So it's a difficult one. I mean, you two are in a very different position, as you said. I know you were on the other side of the fence, Denise, and, you know, it can be frightening. But one of the funny things, which you probably won't find funny, but I found it hilarious at the time, was because we didn't know, and we remember the governance wasn't the same in those days in 2006. The board would say, okay, Joan, so we're trying to look at the next 6 months, you know, so where are we getting the money from? And I said, we will be getting it from the GWP fund. And they said, oh, great. And so what is that? And I said, God will provide fund. That's exactly what it is. That was it. It was a wing and a prayer the whole time. So organizations like yours would have been so good for us and would have helped us so much. And we you know, by you agreeing to give money as well meant that you were rubber stamping us. You believed us. And that was actually as important as the finance, you know?
Yeah, and that comes back to some of the influence. That if a donor steps in and supports something, it's a real sense of kind of belief that this is a project that can actually work. But I think it's interesting as well when you touched on kind of speaking about not kind of being so aligned with HSE. I think that's one of the other things, and you touched on it, Denise, is the freedom that philanthropy can give to causes. Because that private funding enables them to do things that maybe, other sources of funding will not enable them to do. It gives them a freedom. It gives them a sense that this is something that can actually be done. But just maybe coming back, Denise, you spoke there in terms of kind of even, throughout the COVID, where donors did kind of step in, and certainly we've seen it amongst our own members along with kind of other members of the public as well. But also maybe kind of coming to sort of say, well, what can we do? I mean, I think possibly there's often a challenge there for donors as well. Well, where can I give that's actually going to make a difference? I really want my giving to have an impact. What could that look like, and where do I start? Again, just kind of thinking of anybody on the call here tonight, putting that question to you, is that a challenge that maybe you've seen, but it is a challenge that can be managed? How can it best be managed?
Absolutely. So donors would come to us all the time and say that, where can I give? What impact can I have? How do I do it right? And I suppose the first thing we'd say to them is just go for it. Come into us, have a chat, and let's see where your interests are. As I say, so part of, I suppose, the beauty of the Community Foundation model, and we're obviously part of a kind of global community foundation model, is that we can manage people's money, we can do the due diligence, we can do all that bit. So for a lot of donors, that's reassuring to think, okay, I don't have to start an organisation, I don't have to, that's easier for us through donor advised funds, all those hygiene factors. But a lot of the time it is donors saying, well, where do we start? What can we do? And again, as I said, we'd be saying to them, look, we have these collaborative areas that others are giving in. Climate change, empowering generations, accelerating change in the sector. There's lots of ways you can give there. We go through with them. What are the interests? What are you thinking about? And it might be a family where there's 5 or 6 interests. So you're trying to get some possible collaborative areas, or you look at all the different interests. And then we try and match them with areas that they feel that are important to them. So that happens with us all the time. And I think that donors feel really gratified by that. You really think about exactly what Joe was saying. Like if you've had somebody in your family who's died by suicide, or if you have had somebody who has had an addiction issue, or you yourself did brilliantly out of the education system, but you actually feel it's not fit for purpose. There's lots of reasons people come to us. You've done really well, you want to give back to your own community, like place-based giving and county funds is really on the rise for us. So I think that, where do I give? How do I give? Will it make a difference? How will I know it's made a difference? All that due diligence, blah, blah, blah. The thing is, just go for it. We're there, have a chat with you. And we're seeing more and more that people are stepping up to the plate. We've seen that in COVID, and you know it, Eilis, as well from your own work. Like, we gave out 80 million in 2018. It'll be 20 million this year, and maybe 23. Yeah. And so that's with donors really stepping up to the plate, and saying, okay, do you know what? There's a real need there. I'm going to go for it. And maybe it won't be perfect. But as you say, like, philanthropy can do things that others can't. It can do pilots. It can take risks. It can ensure that innovation, like Joan talked about, can be supported. It can add value to state funding and give a bit more flexibility to the organisation. Like, there's so many things philanthropy can do. And I suppose having watched it over the years and having seen the organisations I work with funded by philanthropy in different ways, you really see the impact and how important it is. And I cannot stress enough, like, this recovery is going to need philanthropy. Like, the government have been fantastic. They've increased their funding by 9.6, as we know from Benefax. They collectively are giving more money than any other form of fundraising, but it is going to be under serious pressure, and philanthropy is going to be one of the contributing factors to recovery. And so we really have to think about that. We have to acknowledge it. We have to really encourage donors to step forward and say to them, come on, come with us. Let's look at the recovery together. Let's look at the areas of greatest need. Let's look at the areas that you're interested in, and let's make a difference together.
And I think that that's probably, two things I would say on that. Certainly, I would agree with everything you've said, Denise. But yes, absolutely, that donors kind of did step in the time of COVID, and stepped up to the plate. And it's the small amounts along with the large amounts that kind of make the difference. But that will be needed. But again, it's about kind of the impact, and showing donors the impact. And Joan, that was probably a challenge that you constantly had in Pieta House. You were trying to run the service, I know, and deliver, for the beneficiaries on the ground, the people who were in need at that particular point in time. But at the same time, giving that feedback to donors and letting them know what was actually happening. Was that a challenge?
So what we did, and we discovered as time went on, that measuring outcomes is essential for donors. So what we discovered was, for example, for someone to come to Pieta House, now I don't know what it's like now, but from the first moment that they arrive at the door until 6 months after they finished with us, and we'd be following up with phone calls and, to see how they're doing on a regular basis, it would cost around €1,000 from start to finish. And that became a very easy thing for us to deliver and to say to donors, your 5,000 donation is going to save 5 lives. And it became sort of a mantra for us. And I think it is essential that the donors, and you've said it a few times, Denise, about how they need to know where the money is going and what's it achieving. But you need, from a charity point of view, to be very practical. Make it simple. Make it very simple of this is what you're doing. You're saving a life, or you've bought a machine, or and I think that is a very tangible thing that donors need to hear.
And that it's reasonable for donors to expect it. I think is the other thing, maybe just to say, that it is reasonable for a donor to expect to hear, or to know, or to understand, or, for it to be illustrated to them in terms of kind of what is actually happening. And I think, that's probably one of the beauties of the model of the Community Foundation, because you can take that on, Denise, in terms of, communicating back with donors that, that's something that that model can actually do and be a vehicle for that communication.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah.
No, go ahead.
No, I think measuring impact is one of the greatest challenges for organisations. That very often it's really imperative from a donor perspective, but also from the organisation's perspective. Like, what are we doing? How are we doing it? And we have that ourselves. The challenge, I think, for organisations is that it has to be funded in some ways, that it is difficult to measure impact, to define impact, to measure it and communicate it. And so it is part of, I think, of the work, certainly as a foundation, as a funder, that we're thinking about how do we support that. We've been looking at impact, and I suppose, when you look back over the 21 years that the Community Foundation, and it kind of speaks to the point as well, Eilis, about the multi-annual funding, some of the ways, though, that donors have kind of stayed with an issue or an area hasn't necessarily been multi-annual funding, although some have done that. But they have used their funding over an extended period of time. So if I think about, for example, impact and Community Foundation, and this is dear to my heart, around marriage equality or LGBT+, and all the gains that have been made. The LGBT community was the second grant that the Community Foundation ever made with a donor. So that donor took a risk. It was a new area. It wasn't that sure what was needed. And then in terms of the Community Foundation working with kind of grassroots organisations all over the country, it saw that organisations were starting up a helpline here, there and everywhere. So it did a feasibility study and a national helpline was funded. And again, other donors came in on that. That became LGBT Ireland, which is now one of the leading organisations and support services all around the country. Marriage equality then was something that I suppose was amplified as a campaign, and obviously as a co-founder, I know it from the other side. So again, the Community Foundation was one of their donors said, okay, don't know if this campaign has any hope, but I believe in what it's doing. I'm going to give some money towards it. Another time, Marriage Equality had no money, and it gave money, and as you say, Joan, it gave, I suppose, validation to the campaign, and then it was able to get much larger funding from Atlantic. There was a much bigger funding. And then yesterday was the anniversary, and we looked at those fabulous people from Dublin Castle, first country in the world that voted yes by popular vote. Now, Community Foundation and its donors, some of those donors gave multi-annual funding, but others gave funding at pockets or at acupuncture points over that 20-year history. And now we have another Pride Fund, which we've launched, and some of those are saying, you know what, we'll come again. Or actually we'll bring others to the table. So it's that longevity, I think. I think, again, for donors, you know, even if there's a nervousness, if you're coming into an area where there's a collective attention and a focus on it over an extended period of time, you can see those who can stay the whole journey and others who can dip in and out. But that collective approach, oh my God, the difference it made. I mean, we're one of the leading lights in terms of equality on that issue. I know we have lots of other things to do, but I think it's a great example. And we as a foundation only analysed that the other day because Ronnie, who's on the board of Community Foundation, and myself know the story from the other side. So we were saying, no, but you were crucial here and you were crucial here. So donors were cutting edge, took risks, came in when nobody else would, gave some, I suppose, validation, and they weren't huge amounts of money. They were small amounts of money on the way, gave a bridging loan when we needed it. And when you analyse all the ways that donors can do that, as well as those who gave multi-annual funding, the collective power of it is extraordinary, and it has changed Ireland for good. And there are lots of examples like that. And going forward in the recovery, I think that's what we should be doing. Looking at we know what the big areas now are that are going to be hugely problematic in terms of the pandemic and where we are in the world. So there's great opportunities for donors to come, small ones and big ones, as you say, Eilis, and really make it work.
And to be part of that kind of, I'm going back again to that concept of the journey, but I think what also strikes me in what you're saying, Denise, there, and probably Joan, this would echo your own experience, you know, is that it's not always about kind of all of the funding going to the actual delivery of the service, that sometimes it's the bit of research that needs to be done. Sometimes it's the bit of, you know, so kind of that sense of kind of all of the money going to the end, you know, kind of delivery, you know, it's for donors to understand that those bridging pieces maybe are critically important as well along the way. And Joan, maybe that kind of bridging piece might have enabled your husband to sleep better in the earlier days rather than the mortgage. We'll have to do something about that. I think the other thing, though, Joan, you touched on it and you sort of said, and I would be hugely praiseworthy of donors in Ireland. I think we are generous, but I sometimes kind of wonder, do we fall back on that kind of, you know, we're a very generous nation, we're very good, but you know, what type of donors are we? Are we reactionary? Are we as good as we think we are? Could we do a little bit more? Is there something there, Joan, maybe even from your own experience over the years of how it developed?
I think, first of all, the person has to have a connection, and Denise has said this a couple of times, they have to have a connection. I know you're thinking possibly, you know, you're giving back because you've done well, but for the majority of people, I think they have to have a driving point. And that may not, suicide is an easy one because everybody's been affected by suicide. But one thing that has become very apparent, and I think you referred to Denise there a little while ago, we discovered that the only way we could expand the service to all the other counties was to give the ownership to the county. Because why would you, in Cavan, go and fundraise for Wexford? And so we sort of copped onto that very, very quickly. And so our motto became what's raised in Cavan stays in Cavan. And that spurred people on because they wanted a service in their own county for people who were in crisis. It was a brilliant model to follow. And I think you mentioned, did you say county, Denise, there earlier? Something about county development. Yeah, it's brilliant. Brilliant concept. Yeah. People want to help their own county. I mean, if you look at JP McManus, look what he's done for Limerick. You know, and a lot of people, big donors, would do that same sort of thing for their county.
Yeah, and I suppose that concept of place-based giving, you know, I mean, and I'm quite certain on the call here tonight that maybe there are a lot of diaspora. I think diaspora kind of giving is obviously important as well. And I suppose within that kind of, it strikes me, you know, have we seen kind of changed patterns? You know, is there increased diaspora giving? What's millennial giving look like? You know, what does corporates look like? You know, is there kind of that shift from just the traditional CSO to actually sort of saying, well, strategically, we can step in and do something quite different? I'm not sure, Denise, if you see that in terms of kind of any changing patterns in how people are giving or, you know, kind of the way they're doing it.
Yeah, so I suppose we've seen a number of emerging trends over the last while. So you're quite right. Place-based giving is something that we've seen where local people are saying, let's get together and set up a county fund. We have the Monaghan one. We've people now interested in Sligo and Kerry. Let's get some local philanthropists and let's give back to the area. Or you have somebody who's done well from the area who really wants to put some resources in. So that's definitely something that's on the increase, and we'd love to see a county fund in every county in Ireland. I think that would be fantastic. Yeah. We've also seen where the combination of the generosity of giving, no matter what level, with public funding and time. So if you take Orchida's Comic Relief, you had artists come together, you had the government giving match funding, and you had the generosity of the Irish people. They give it then to the Community Foundation, and our job then is to talk to the sector and say, what do you need for this money? They said to us, we need to adapt and pivot our services, and we need a digital infrastructure. So that's another kind of combination model that I think we'll see more of, where that generosity of the Irish people, supported by public funding and time, is then turned into strategic giving and informed by the sector and what they need. And we're seeing it with the RG Toy Show as well. There's no doubt that intergenerational wealth is very high. So we're seeing two things in Ireland. We're seeing intergenerational poverty, which and young people, poverty for young people, and we're seeing intergenerational wealth. And wouldn't it be great if one could really support the elimination of another? Wouldn't that be fantastic? Yeah. There's no doubt for us then that younger people, next generation, are really interested in issues like climate, countering the far right. You know, there's lots of the digital divide, but they have issues that they're very closely connected to and value. So we're seeing lots of different, we're seeing increased giving, we're seeing those who are giving more. And then finally, I'd say what we're seeing is like that when there's a COVID emergency fund, where you have people who are coming in and saying, I'm actually going to give unrestricted funding. I'm going to give funding. You, Community Foundation, know where the need is. We're going to trust you to give it out there and do the due diligence and the hygiene. Or they're saying, we've worked with these organisations and we'd like to give them unrestricted multi-annual funding. So there's lots of different ways of giving, I think, that are emerging. And certainly the feedback that we get from the sector is that is really helpful.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's very heartening to kind of hear that, in terms of kind of the myriad of ways, and also kind of the fact that it is actually increasing. But I think it's also something to kind of, again, and I suppose I'm thinking of people on the call here tonight that may be donors or that maybe are looking at their giving. In other words, sort of saying, well, look, it can be done differently. It can be, you can use kind of so many intermediary organizations to support that, and kind of that collective piece as well. I suppose one of the things that kind of just, comes to mind, and, it's how do we, what's needed to encourage and support even greater giving? Given that, Denise, you're saying intergenerational wealth is going to be huge. So we do know that within the country, there is the means there to do things. Now, that does not mean that there's any pressure on anybody to do anything. It doesn't mean that anybody has to do something, or that there's a responsibility there. But I'm just kind of wondering, in terms of how do we encourage it? How do we kind of, start that kind of going back to the journey piece? How do we begin to encourage it, and even at an early age? And Joan, I don't know, maybe you've seen kind of over the years how people might have come with you on that journey.
I think the key is telling a story. The narrative around giving. It's not just giving the facts that we need 100,000 to start up a new whatever. It is pulling at the heartstrings, and I don't mean that from a manipulation point of view. I'm talking about trying to get people to look at the problem from a different perspective. And so it's creating that narrative, but it's also, encouraging people to give because of how they're going to feel afterwards, and I think that's really important, linking the two things together. But you mentioned diaspora earlier, and, if it wasn't seriously for the Irish, I mean, as you said, I started a place in Solid's House in New York. What sort of Egypt? I mean, the song, if you can do it there, you can do it anywhere. It really is true, because it was the hardest thing, going over by myself and starting. But the Irish were extraordinary and immediately embraced. And not only were they giving and helped set up Solid's House in New York and then 2 centres, but it wasn't just for the Irish, it was for everyone. And in fact, after a while, what we discovered was that there were 54% of people coming to us were not Irish. So it was the Irish giving for international. It wasn't just the Irish focusing on the Irish. So again, they were listening to a story. And I think that's where the Irish are brilliant. They're listening to the story, and that is what appeals to them and encourages them to give.
Mm. And I think that goes back to kind of that concept of, the giving is doing good for the beneficiary, but also there's a joy in it, that you will, as a donor, you will get a lot out of it as well along the way, and that's kind of critically important as well. I'm just noticing that we're kind of moving close on time, and I suppose just reflecting on some of the conversation, I think there's been a couple of kind of key things that have come out. I think that sense of the collective and the partnership, that we can work collaboratively as donors, and that there are organisations there such as Community Foundation for Ireland that can help within that and support you within that. That giving doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be the millionaires. We're not talking about, you both have referenced kind of quite small sums that have made significant difference at particular points in time, depending on the point in time and depending on the need that is actually there at any given time. The concept that impact is important, and knowing how your giving is doing, that is critically important, and that it's reasonable for donors to want to know that, and to even ask the question of kind of what's actually going to happen with this. That's a reasonable question. I think in terms of, I'm also hearing that kind of donors are doing things. They are stepping up. We've seen that during COVID, absolutely, in Philanthropy Ireland. You're seeing that, Denise, very clearly in Community Foundation, with comic relief, but that there's always more to do. And that comes back to kind of that sense of kind of the need for the multi-annual funding, and, kind of that sense of going on the journey, that you might not do it initially, but that you might actually kind of get there along the way as well, and kind of feel more comfortable with that as you go along. So I suppose kind of one of the things that I would kind of maybe just ask you is to reflect on, for those listening in here tonight, and I'm quite certain there's families, there's diaspora, there's, the big donors, there's those that are passionate about one cause and one cause only, there's those that are really trying to think, what can I actually do? Where do I start with any of this? Or, well, I've only got this amount to make sure. What difference is that going to make? It's only a drop in the ocean when you consider the size of the problems or whatever. So at the same time, I'm hearing kind of very positive about, the power of kind of giving and, the difference it can make. Could I maybe just ask for both of you, thinking of people tuning in here tonight, what would you say to them? What would be a takeaway for you? Yes, we're heading into very turbulent times, post-COVID, and what that might look like. There's so much unknown. There's so much need, but there's also so much opportunity. So for anybody listening in here this evening, what would you say is a takeaway that you would say to them? Look, I would say to you, just whatever. Is it just get going? If it is get going, how, what would your takeaway be? Joan, maybe if I go to you first, and Denise, I'll come to you then.
You ask Denise first. But my takeaway would be, I think we need to focus. We've had such a difficult year. I think we need to focus on gratitude, that we have survived. And what can we show in gratitude, that not only have we survived, we've thrived in so many ways. And that for those who may not have, what can we do to make them, better in their lives? And I always think that gratitude is the most important thing. It stops us thinking of ourselves only and allows us to think of others. So that would be the thing I would say to try and take away with you tonight.
For sure. Thanks, Joan. Very, very true. Very true in terms of the gratitude piece. So important, because it's what kind of reminds us every so often of kind of what we can do and what needs to be done. Denise, is there anything in particular that you would say?
Yeah, I suppose what I would say to people listening out there is that, and I think the word that you used had a resonance for me, is around opportunity. So yes, we have been through a terrible time, but we have seen the agility and the innovation of communities and organisations to respond to that in a way that we never have, I think, before. And we need to support that. And there's a real opportunity for anybody out there who's interested to be part of that. So to, I suppose, minimise the negative impact, but really to be part of a collaborative vision that is able to be agile, innovative, creative, and affect real and meaningful change. That there's, and the other takeaway for me, I suppose, is very often philanthropy is viewed as a particular type of person, that you have to have a certain amount of wealth, or you have to have a certain amount. And I suppose that's the bit I'd like to kind of blow out of the water here today. You've seen loads of examples where actually, people can make a real difference with the variety of means. So I think if anybody's out there and they think, actually, I'd like to be part of that, to get in touch with one of the foundations, get in touch with ourselves, get in touch with Pieta House, get in touch and start the journey. And I think whether it's with the Community Foundation or whether it's directly with organisations, I think it's a really, really good time to engage.
Yeah. And I think that's so true, that there are supports out there to help people to navigate their way through it, kind of whatever way that might be, and I think I would agree with you in terms of kind of, the classic philanthropist, is there a classic philanthropist? Is there a classic donor? I don't think there is, certainly in my experience in working in this sector. There isn't. There's every class and description out there. And I think certainly what I would be saying is, yes, kind of get started and get going. And I think, just picking up, Joan, a little bit on your gratitude kind of comment there, I think sometimes it also kind of is good to remember that Actually, and I often say this to anybody I'm talking to about philanthropy, just to reflect a little. I don't think there's anybody in Ireland who has not been a beneficiary of philanthropy in some way. Whether you look at it from kind of whether it's kind of the referenda that you referred to earlier, Denise, whether you think in terms of kind of our beloved arts institutions such as the National Gallery or anything like that, whether you think of anybody who's on the call here tonight that has gone to UCD, all of these have been really well supported through philanthropy, through giving, through donations, and we've all benefited. Every one of us as a society has benefited. And that's the difference, and that's the change that we're actually hoping to make through good giving. Can I just maybe begin to close off on that and say a huge thank you to Denise and Joan. I think, your insights in relation to both the journeys, the various kind of visions of various organizations at different stages, what has been achieved. I think going back to Joan, you said, bring it to life, the story. I think that has been so well conveyed here tonight, the story of what philanthropy can do and the impact that it can have and the joy that can actually bring, in terms of being a part of that story and being a part of that change. So to all the donors on the call, I would say a huge thank you. Great that you're doing it. I am obviously going to say to everybody, is there opportunity for us to do more? There's always opportunity to do more. Can you be a part of that? And if you can, please do reach out to any of the organisations that are here on this call tonight, or indeed to any of the organisations that you know directly yourselves. I would like to say a huge thank you to UCD for your, I would say, kind of foresight in terms of actually bringing this theme out into a discussion. It's been fantastic. So I am, for one, I'm delighted that I joined the conversation with you here tonight on philanthropy and giving. And I have no doubts that anybody tuning in has also kind of benefited from it as well. So a huge thank you to everybody who has joined us on the call here this evening. And what I would leave you with is to sort of say, look, if you want to follow up on anything you've heard here tonight, the Community Foundation for Ireland, very easily found by a now quick Google check. Same Pieta House, if you want to kind of connect there. I have no doubts that Joan would be delighted to see you connect there as well. Or indeed, if you would like to connect with us in Philanthropy Ireland, as the overarching association who looks at all of the various models of giving and the various connections, etc., that are there in order to do that, please do come to us. We want to hear from you. We may very well end up directing you towards Community Foundation for Ireland as the best vehicle for you at any particular point in time, or to UCD Foundation, or to one of them. But we connect with all of them, and we would be delighted to share our insight and learning. And I suppose that just comes back to sort of saying, all models of giving are valid, all causes are valid. It's just about getting involved. Please do that. And thanks so much for joining us here this evening. Again, thank you to the speakers, and a huge thank you to UCD Festival for enabling this conversation here tonight. Go well. Thank you.
Thanks, Eilis.